Gosh, I got here this morning and I realized it's August, and I thought, wow, I don't know if I'm ready for this yet, but here it is. It's August. It's the first Sunday in August, which is the start of what we traditionally call Unity Month, because August is the month where we find the birthdays of our two co-founders, Charles and Myrtle Fillmore. They're the reason that we're all here this morning. It's because each of us found something in what they created that really speaks to us and made a positive, practical difference in our lives. So whatever it is that brought us here, it all started back in 1889. That's when Charles and Myrtle first published a magazine. Actually, it was a pamphlet really back in those days. It was called Modern Thought. They operated out of the living room of their home, Kansas City, Missouri. Charles was a self-educated real estate broker. Myrtle was a school teacher and a housewife. Got the pictures of them up there from their earlier days, and as you can see, Charles married an older woman, which is not a bad thing. I won't make any. Karen's giving me the fist pump there. Yes, indeed. Myrtle has an interesting history. She was a Midwestern girl, Ohio basically, raised in a religious family, but she didn't want to join the family's church because she couldn't accept the teachings of those mainline churches in those days. So the thing is that Myrtle didn't have a lot of embedded theology that she had to undo later. New ideas came to her pretty easily, and the same thing was basically true of Charles. He grew up out on the wild frontier in St. Cloud, Minnesota, actually on an Indian reservation. He had no formal schooling, and he was not raised with any formal religious training. So again, another person who didn't have a lot of excess baggage they had to get rid of in order to come up with new ideas about religion and Christianity and spirituality in general. Now, the main reason that Unity came to be was because Myrtle Fillmore came down with tuberculosis. And we have to remember what the practice of medicine was like back in those days. This is before the turn of the century. It was still in its infancy in those days, medicine was. Doctors, they could diagnose an illness, but they had no antibiotics, and God help you if they wanted to do surgery, because there were no anesthetics or anything like that, or at least the anesthetics weren't particularly good or effective. All those things came along after the turn of the century. Antibiotics, anesthesia, and different things that we take for granted. Think about it. Pain relief back in the days of Charles and Myrtle were often via different kinds of opiates. You've heard of laudanum and stuff like that. Very addictive and that kind of thing. And really all the doctor could do for you in those days was to prescribe rest, proper diet, keep the patient hydrated, really so the body could heal itself. And the results were not good. Up until the 20th century, less than half of all children lived to see their 21st birthday. That's a pretty grim statistic. Things are a lot different today. So Myrtle was desperate to find a cure, and since the doctors really couldn't help much, she took matters into her own hands. She used a combination of positive prayer and affirmations and a thought process that she looked upon as teaching her body how to heal itself. Teaching her body that it was not subject to the limitation of the disease, but that it was actually, in truth, spiritually whole and strong. And it worked. Her disease disappeared. The doctors were telling her that she probably wouldn't live much past 1890, and of course we all know she did much better than that. She lived until 1931. She died when she was 86 years old. So she had a healthy, successful, and prosperous life, despite the dire predictions that she was receiving from the medical profession as it was back in those days. Myrtle had a personal mission and vision. Her personal mission and her personal ministry was one of healing and helping and nurturing and teaching. It came natural to her. She was the driving force behind the organization that started out as the Society of Silent Help, which we now know as Silent Unity, the 24/7 prayer ministry that we have today. Another one of her great gifts was her work with children. She firmly believed that children were receiving the wrong message in those days about the nature of life and death and religion and spirituality. So in 1893, she became the editor of a monthly magazine for children. Kind of rare in those days. The monthly magazine was called Wee Wisdom. A lot of you, some of you folks who have been in Unity for a long time have probably heard of that. It's out of publication now. But the magazine was called Wee Wisdom, and then in 1896 she wrote a children's book called Wee Wisdom's Way, which you can still find. Now think of it. This was back in the days when children were being told that they were supposed to be seen and not heard. That kind of, heck, I got that message in the 60s, but that was it started all the way back then. Little children should be seen and not heard. Back in the days when religious education for children consisted of feeding them stories about demons and devils and the hellfire that awaited them if they were disobedient, which it's a form of child abuse, if you ask me. So she had a whole different message that she wanted to get across to the children of the world. Now we talked about Myrtle's health problems, which she managed to overcome, and Charles had some health challenges as well. When he was a boy living up there in Minnesota, he was ice skating one day and he dislocated his hip in a skating accident. And again, due to the lack of competent medical care, his hip socket was destroyed and he had to wear a leg brace and a 4-inch lift on his shoe for the rest of his life. So Charles witnessed what was going on with his wife Myrtle, her healing experience, and he decided to investigate and see for himself, because he was what you would call a skeptic. A skeptic is someone who questions things. A skeptic is someone who investigates. Somebody makes a claim, they're going to say, okay, I'll look into it. They're going to ask questions and investigate. Karen's pointing to me. She says, yes. Well, I cop to that. Yes, I admit this freely. And again, Charles had no interest in religion because all he could see was conflict and contradiction. So instead of accepting anything on someone's say-so or by authority, he would dive into it himself. And when it came to religion, he essentially said that the whole thing was so contradictory that it was a fraud unless he could get into it and find something practical, useful, and realistic. So Myrtle's healing experience drove him forward in his quest, and from that and their partnership springs the Unity movement that we know of today. Charles, in many respects, was influenced by some people that came before him. This idea of self-reliance and figuring things out for yourself really came from some other free thinkers who came before him, people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. They had been challenging religious and social and political values for a long time before Charles came along, and you will find that Charles Fillmore quotes Emerson in many of his books. So if you want to get a little bit of an idea of where Charles was coming from, it helps to see some quotes from Emerson's book, Self-Reliance. Check this out, where Emerson says, "I am ashamed to think how easily we capitulate to badges and names, to large societies and dead institutions." That's a good one. Next one, he says, "Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. And finally, nothing can bring you peace but yourself. Nothing can bring you peace but the triumph of principles." Principles, integrity of mind, and not capitulating to the claims of authority. Those were the core values expressed by Emerson, which deeply influenced Charles Fillmore. Charles was building on the ideas of those who came before him, and they in turn were building on the ideas of those that came before them. I think it's a great thing, it's a wonderful thing, it's important to honor and celebrate our intellectual ancestors, so long as we don't put them on a pedestal and turn their ideas or them into idols to be worshipped and not questioned. Great quote from Sir Isaac Newton, which is the title of the talk today. Sir Isaac Newton once said, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." That's a great quote, but he said something else which I think is just as important. He said this, he said, "Plato is my friend, Aristotle is my friend, but my greatest friend is truth." Self-reliance means that each generation has to decide which ideas still make sense, which ideas are still supported by evidence. We don't have to blindly accept everything that they say or that they said. That's why I tend to cringe whenever I hear people in unity saying things like, we have to get back to what Charles and Myrtle really taught. And I think, wow, really? And exactly what is that? And who gets to say what that is? They adopt this holier than thou attitude, which is the kind of attitude I was trying to get away with when I joined Unity. I wanted to get away from the holier than thou attitude, but there it is. Actually, I guess the more accurate thing to call it is it's the holier and more authentically Fillmorian than thou attitude that we see out there sometimes, which is exactly the kind of thing that Charles and Myrtle were dead set against. Beware of dogma. Beware of dogma. Definition, dogma. A principle or set of principles laid down by an authority as incontrovertibly true, not to be questioned. No doubts allowed. Doesn't work for me, and it didn't work for our co-founders. We have no dogma in Unity, or at least we're not supposed to. And that can sometimes make things seem a bit chaotic. And that's just because that kind of radical freedom is a bit scary to a lot of people. Having to find our own way can be scary. There's a story in the Hebrew Bible, story of the Israelites in the book of Exodus. The story tells us they were slaves in Egypt. They were given food, clothing, shelter, and they were forced to work, making bricks, working in the fields, whatever. They were slaves. So along comes Moses, and he leads them out of Egypt into freedom. Free at last, but they had to find their way through the wilderness. They had to find their own food. They had to find their own shelter and water. And you know what a bunch of them wanted to do? Go back into Egypt. They said, hey, we were slaves, but at least we had food and water and people telling us what to do. Someone please feed me and tell me what to do. That's the childhood stage of development, right? That's what children go through. When we become adults, we start to learn that others do not necessarily know what is best for us. And yet, even as adults, we often find ourselves still chasing gurus and their dogma. It happens. We throw away the precious gift of freedom and we give our power away. Anyone ever see a short little movie called Kumari? Kumari, here's the DVD box. Kumari, the true story of a false prophet. This is a documentary by an Indian-American filmmaker named Vikram Gandhi. He decided to see what would happen if he turned himself into a fake Indian guru named Kumari. Now, he had absolutely no background for this other than his natural-born appearance. He didn't even know yoga. He had to hire a teacher to teach him how to teach yoga. And then he had to fake an Indian accent based on the way he heard his grandmother talk. So he transforms himself. He goes from this to this. All right? And as you can see, he grew the beard longer because we all know that when you grow your beard longer, that results in instant credibility, right? So, for those of you who have been wondering, I've been telling you wait till Halloween to find out, but no, that's, a longer beard equals more credibility, or at least that's what he thought. So he gets all dressed up like this, and he heads off to Arizona to see if he could attract some followers. And that's when things got out of control. He succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined. I mean, his talks were pure gibberish. But there were plenty of people around who were willing to follow him without question. I think he just started out wondering how people would react to him. But then it turns out that he was the one who was starting to get sucked in. A few people responded positively, and he kind of likes being in the position of authority. It's intoxicating. He had no idea, or at least I hope he had no idea, of what kind of an ethical problem he was creating by consciously or unconsciously creating that kind of dependency among these people who really believed he was the real thing. And so you have to see the movie to see how it all came out. But a very interesting object lesson. We're too willing to give our power away. And there are plenty of people who are willing to accept it. It's the polar opposite of self-reliance. Charles and Myrtle did not want to be worshipped. They invited dialogue. They invited debate. They invited questions. One of the things we say in Unity is that you don't have to park your brain outside the sanctuary door when you come here. We welcome that kind of thing. Yeah, I've told the story before, I think, about Dr. Tom Shepard. He used to be a Unity minister out here in Sacramento for a time, and he now teaches theology and history back at Unity Institute, which is our seminary back in Kansas City. And one of the things he likes to tell us is to take every idea that they come across, turn it upside down, look on the bottom, and see if it has an expiration date on it. I think that's a great thing to do, except I'm such a skeptic, you know, that I don't even trust expiration dates, okay? To me, an expiration date is more of a suggestion than anything else. I don't care how long it's been in the refrigerator. I don't care if it's beyond the expiration date or not. If it looks good, if it smells good, I say go for it. Drives Karen nuts. She says, oh, don't eat that. It's been in there too long. I say, well, smells okay to me. There's no green, fuzzy, or slimy stuff growing on it. So expiration dates are just another piece of evidence to consider. That's what this is all about, is looking at it and making up your own mind instead of just blindly accepting something stamped on it. There's a lot of different things we can do with it. So, for example, if something sounds like gibberish, like Kumari, if something sounds like gibberish, now that doesn't necessarily mean we should automatically disregard it, but we also might want to consider the possibility that it might very well be just a lot of gibberish, a lot of nonsense, that kind of thing. Charles and Myrtle intentionally set out to create a movement that was non-authoritarian and without dogma or a set statement of faith. And they have given us a great gift, and it requires active participation rather than just passive acceptance, because Unity is meant to be a working laboratory, not a museum and not a shrine. So, we honor our founders, and to paraphrase Sir Isaac Newton, Charles Fillmore is our friend and teacher. Myrtle Fillmore is our friend and teacher, but they wanted our greatest friend and teacher to be reason and truth. So we're going to celebrate them this month, and we're going to see how that works going into the future, because that's what they wanted us to do, was to be moving forward and not going back. We'll see you next week.